The radio crackled to life at 0300 hours. An American voice, tight with stress, requesting immediate link-up with Australian forces operating in the same sector. The Australian sergeant on duty at Nui Dot Base listened to the transmission with practiced stillness, his face revealing nothing. When the American liaison officer arrived 6 hours later, what he said would echo through classified intelligence channels for decades. "Your men," the American began carefully, "they told my patrol to leave their area of operations, said we were compromising their position." He paused, searching for diplomatic language. "They said we didn't belong there." The Australian sergeant's response was delivered with the flat courtesy that passes for bluntness in military circles. "They were right. You don't." This was not arrogance. This was mathematics. American patrols in Puaktui province were suffering casualty rates approaching 10%. Australian forces operating in the same terrain, facing the same enemy, were losing less than 1% of their strength. The numbers told a story that pride could not obscure. Something fundamental separated how these two allies approached the same war, and that difference was measured in body bags. But to understand why Australian SAS operators would tell American soldiers they didn't belong in the jungle, you have to go back to a moment 3 years earlier, when the first Australian Special Forces arrived in Vietnam and American commanders made a mistake they would spend the rest of the war trying to correct. The arrival in April 1966, when the advance elements of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment stepped off transport aircraft at Tan Son Nhut Air Base, American military planners barely noticed. The force consisted of approximately 120 men rotating through on squadron-strength deployments. In a war where the United States was fielding over 500,000 troops, a force that small seemed almost quaint, a gesture of alliance more than a meaningful contribution. American commanders were polite during initial briefings. They provided the Australians with intelligence summaries, area maps, and recommendations for operational zones. The Australians listened with what Americans interpreted as professional courtesy. What the Americans did not recognize was that Australian SAS officers were conducting their own evaluation, and that evaluation was producing conclusions that would have shocked their hosts. The Australians had been watching American operations for months before deploying their own forces. Members of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, advisors embedded with South Vietnamese units since 1962, had observed American tactical methods with growing concern. They had watched large American formations crash through jungle terrain with all the subtlety of mechanized warfare. They had monitored radio traffic that announced patrol positions to anyone with a receiver. They had noted casualty statistics that suggested American infantry was being systematically hunted by an enemy who could hear them coming from kilometers away. Australian military doctrine had evolved through different crucibles. The Malayan emergency of the 1950s had taught Australian forces how to fight communist insurgents in jungle terrain. The Indonesian confrontation in Borneo during the early 1960s had refined those lessons under conditions of extreme operational security, where patrols operated for weeks without support in hostile territory. Australian SAS had learned to move through triple canopy jungle in complete silence, to survive on minimal resupply, and to achieve objectives through patience rather than firepower. When Australian commanders requested their own tactical area of responsibility separate from American operational control, some American officers interpreted this as colonial standoffishness. The truth was more pragmatic. The Australians had concluded that American methods would get Australian soldiers killed, and they wanted the freedom to fight their own war. The United States Army agreed to the request, though not for the reasons Australians preferred. American planners were happy to assign the Australians to Puaktui province, a coastal region southeast of Saigon that American forces found frustrating and unrewarding. The province contained dense jungle, limited strategic value in conventional terms, and Viet Cong units that seemed able to operate with impunity despite repeated American efforts to pacify the area. The American assessment was simple. If the Australians wanted their own province, they could have one that didn't matter much anyway. This calculation would prove to be one of the great miscalculations of the war. The first encounters. The friction began almost immediately, though it took subtle forms that would not appear in official reports for months. American liaison officers assigned to coordinate with Australian forces at Nui Dat, the main Australian base, encountered operational methods that seemed deliberately designed to contradict everything American military doctrine taught. The Australians patrolled slowly, sometimes taking 9 hours to cover a single kilometer. They refused helicopter insertion for most operations, preferring to walk into their areas of operation from bases that could be 20 kilometers away. They operated in patrol groups of only 4 to 6 men, a force so small that American tactical manuals classified it as a reconnaissance element rather than a combat patrol. When American officers suggested that Australian forces coordinate more closely with American units operating in adjacent sectors, Australian commanders politely declined. When Americans recommended that Australians adopt heliborne assault tactics that had proven effective in American operations, Australians thanked them for the advice and continued patrolling on foot. When Americans pointed out that Australian kill ratios seemed low compared to American body counts, Australians noted that their casualty rates were also low and suggested that sustainable operations mattered more than impressive statistics. The real collision came when American units requested permission to operate in Puaktui province within the Australian tactical area of responsibility. In June 1967, an American company from the 173rd Airborne Brigade was conducting operations in Bien Hoa province when they received intelligence suggesting a significant Viet Cong presence just across the border in Puaktui. The American commander requested permission to pursue into Australian territory. The Australian Task Force commander denied the request. The American response was volcanic. An enemy force was escaping across an arbitrary boundary line, and Allied forces were refusing to engage because of territorial concerns that seemed to have more to do with pride than tactical sense. The American commander went up his chain of command. The request reached General William Westmoreland, commander of all American forces in Vietnam. Westmoreland personally contacted the Australian Task Force Command. He did not precisely order the Australians to allow American forces into Puaktui, because the Australians operated under their own national command and could not be directly ordered by American officers, but he made it clear that he considered the refusal to be uncooperative and contrary to Allied unity. The Australians relented with conditions. American forces would be permitted to operate in specified sectors of Puaktui for limited durations, but they would coordinate their movements with Australian forces and would withdraw when requested. What happened next would be discussed in classified debriefings for years afterward. The exposure. The American company that entered Puaktui province in late June 1967 consisted of 118 experienced paratroopers. They had been in Vietnam for 7 months. They had conducted dozens of similar operations. They considered themselves professional soldiers, executing doctrine that had been refined through thousands of engagements across the entire theater of operations. They lasted 48 hours before requesting extraction. The problem was not enemy action. The Viet Cong in their sector maintained a low profile, avoiding contact, as they typically did when facing American forces in strength. The problem was Australian observers. 2 Australian SAS patrols were operating in adjacent areas, conducting their normal reconnaissance activities. When the American company moved into the province, Australian patrol leaders radioed back to Nuua Dat base that American forces had entered their operational area. Australian commanders asked the SAS patrols to observe American methods and provide assessments. What those SAS troopers reported would eventually reach the desk of the Australian Task Force commander, who would include portions of it in his next classified assessment to Canberra. The American company moved through jungle terrain using standard American tactical methods. They traveled in column formation, roughly 100 men strung out along animal trails and paths of least resistance. They communicated by radio frequently, coordinating movements between platoons. They took regular breaks for water and meals. They established perimeter positions at night, with sentries posted at intervals around their bivouac area. From the Australian perspective, every single element of this operation was fundamentally wrong. The Australians had positioned themselves within observation distance of the American company without the Americans detecting their presence. This alone revealed a disparity in fieldcraft that Australian observers found disturbing. The Americans were operating in terrain the Australians considered moderately difficult, but far from impossible for concealed movement. Yet the American force seemed unable to detect 2 4-man patrols that were close enough to hear American radio traffic without electronic assistance. The Australian assessment documented specific failures that violated basic principles of jungle warfare as the Australians understood it. The Americans moved on trails, which meant they followed predictable routes that any competent enemy could monitor or booby-trap. They communicated by radio using procedures that might have been secure against Viet Cong intercept, but were certainly detectable by direction-finding equipment. They maintained formations appropriate for conventional warfare, but suicidal in jungle terrain, where visibility rarely exceeded 15 meters. Most damning was what the Australians could smell. Australian SAS doctrine emphasized scent discipline as fundamental to survival. Soldiers on patrol eliminated all foreign odors that might mark them as Western combatants rather than Vietnamese locals. They stopped using soap, deodorant, toothpaste, and insect repellent weeks before deploying on operations. They ate local food to change their body chemistry. By insertion day, they smelled like the jungle itself. The Americans smelled like Americans. Deodorant, cigarette smoke, coffee, cleaning solvents for weapons, insect repellent containing DEET. The Australians could detect the American company's position from over 500 meters downwind. If the Australians could smell them, so could the Viet Cong. The Australian patrol leader monitoring the American force sent a laconic radio transmission back to base. They smell like a PX. Enemy will detect them from half a kilometer. Recommend they withdraw before VC positions ambush. The message was passed to the American liaison officer at Nuua Dat. He was not amused. A tense radio conversation followed. The American officer suggested that Australian concerns were overblown and possibly motivated by territorial resentment at having American forces in their province. The Australian commander replied that his SAS patrols could demonstrate exactly how detectable American forces were if the American commander was willing to learn. The American company commander agreed, though later debriefing suggested he expected the demonstration to vindicate American methods and embarrass the Australians. Instead, what happened over the next 6 hours would fundamentally change how some American officers thought about jungle warfare. The demonstration. The Australian SAS patrol leader, a sergeant with 3 years of jungle experience in Borneo and Vietnam, proposed a simple test. His patrol would approach the American perimeter position after dark and mark American sentry posts without being detected. If the Americans detected the Australian approach and prevented the marking, Australian concerns about American fieldcraft would be considered unfounded. If the Australians succeeded, American methods would be demonstrated inadequate for the operational environment. The American company commander accepted immediately. He positioned his best troops on sentry duty, reinforced the perimeter with additional listening posts, and briefed his men that Australian forces would attempt to penetrate their position. He told them to treat it as real combat. Any detected Australian would be challenged as hostile. The Australians began their approach at 2100 hours, 3 hours after full darkness. They moved from a position approximately 400 meters from the American perimeter. The approach took them 5 hours and 40 minutes. American sentries heard nothing. Listening posts equipped with basic sound detection equipment registered ambient jungle noise only. Patrols sent out to sweep the area around the perimeter at irregular intervals found no sign of enemy or Allied presence. At 0240 hours, the Australian patrol leader radioed the American company commander and informed him that the demonstration was complete. The marking was in place. The American commander immediately ordered a full perimeter inspection. His troops found small pieces of white engineer tape tied to vegetation at intervals around the entire American position. 12 markers total, each one positioned within meters of American sentry posts or listening stations. The Americans had not detected a single approach, not one. The Australian patrol had moved to within arm's reach of American defensive positions, marked those positions, and withdrawn without creating any disturbance that American soldiers could detect. The Americans had been completely blind to a threat that had circled their entire perimeter and could have destroyed them at will. The American company commander requested immediate extraction the following morning. In his after-action report, later classified at high levels, he noted that his forces were inadequately trained for operations in the Australian sector and recommended that American units not be tasked with missions in Puaktui province without significant additional preparation. The report noted one additional observation that would circulate through American special operations communities for years afterward. Australian SAS operates at a level of fieldcraft that American forces cannot currently match. Recommend detailed study of Australian methods. But this was only the first demonstration. What came next would be far more disturbing to American observers. The philosophy divide. General William Westmoreland visited the Australian task force at Nui Dat in January 1967. His assessment, delivered to Australian commanders with characteristic directness, was that Australian forces were very inactive and not being aggressive enough. The comment was not intended as diplomatic critique. Westmoreland genuinely believed that Australian operational tempo was insufficient to achieve meaningful results against Viet Cong forces in Puaktui province. American doctrine emphasized constant pressure on enemy forces through aggressive search-and-destroy operations. Westmoreland looked at Australian patrol statistics and saw a force that seemed reluctant to engage. The Australian Task Force commander, Brigadier Oliver Jackson, responded with a presentation that revealed just how different Australian and American concepts of warfare had become. Jackson explained that Australian forces had conducted over 400 patrols in Puaktui province during the previous 6 months. These patrols typically lasted between 5 and 14 days, with soldiers living in the jungle under operational conditions for the entire duration. Australian doctrine emphasized patience, detailed intelligence gathering, and engagements conducted from positions of overwhelming tactical advantage. American operations, Jackson noted carefully, tended to prioritize speed and volume of activity. American patrols moved quickly through assigned areas, made contact with enemy forces when encountered, and relied on artillery and air support to achieve fire superiority. This approach generated impressive statistics in terms of enemy killed and territory covered. Australian operations moved slowly, avoided contact unless conditions were favorable, and achieved objectives through extended observation rather than direct engagement. This approach generated lower body counts, but also vastly lower friendly casualties. Westmoreland's response was blunt. Body count was the metric that mattered in Vietnam. Killing enemy soldiers was the objective. Australian methods might reduce friendly casualties, but they were not winning the war. Jackson's counter-argument would be vindicated by events, though not in ways that would satisfy either commander. The Australian approach in Puaktui province was producing effects that body counts could not measure. Viet Cong forces in the province were not being destroyed in large-scale engagements, but they were being systematically degraded through attrition and psychological pressure. Australian patrols ambushed supply routes, eliminated small enemy groups moving between positions, and created an environment where Viet Cong units could not operate freely even in areas they had controlled for years. By late 1967, captured Viet Cong documents revealed that enemy forces in Puaktui had been instructed to avoid contact with Australian units whenever possible. The documents used a specific term for Australian forces, Ma Rung, which translates approximately as jungle ghosts or phantoms of the jungle. This was not a term of respect in the conventional sense. It was a warning. Viet Cong fighters were being told that Australians were fundamentally different from American forces, that they hunted differently, fought differently, and could not be engaged using the tactics that worked against American patrols. American intelligence analysts who reviewed these captured documents struggled to understand what made Australian forces so uniquely threatening to an enemy that had learned to fight American troops effectively. The answer lay in methods that American military culture found difficult to accept. The cultural gap. Navy SEAL Roger Hayden spent 10 days with an Australian SAS patrol in 1968. He would later describe the experience as the most educational military training he ever received, surpassing everything he learned at Army Ranger School, Raider School, and SEAL qualification training. The 10 days were conducted in complete silence. The Australians did not speak during the entire patrol. They communicated through hand signals so subtle that Hayden missed most of them in the first 48 hours. They moved at speed so slow that Hayden initially thought they were deliberately hazing the American observer. They remained motionless for hours at a time, simply watching and listening, without the fidgeting and minor movements that Americans unconsciously made while trying to stay still. What Hayden witnessed was not merely tactical technique, it was a fundamentally different relationship with the environment. The Australians were not moving through hostile jungle. They were part of the jungle, indistinguishable from it in sound, scent, and behavior. Hayden's report to his SEAL Team commander noted that American Special Operations Forces emphasized technological superiority, physical conditioning, and aggressive action. Australian SAS emphasized fieldcraft, patience, and becoming invisible. The Americans were warriors entering enemy territory. The Australians were predators in their natural habitat. This distinction went beyond training. It touched on cultural differences that made Australian methods difficult to transplant into American military institutions. Australian military culture had evolved through decades of small wars on the margins of empire. Australian forces had fought in the Boer War, the Malayan Emergency, and Borneo confrontation, conflicts where patient small unit operations achieved results that conventional firepower could not. Australian soldiers were trained to operate independently for extended periods without higher command supervision. Australian tactical doctrine assumed that junior leaders on the ground knew more about immediate conditions than commanders at headquarters. American military culture emphasized the chain of command, coordination between units, and reliance on superior firepower and logistics. American soldiers were trained to call for support when encountering enemy resistance. American doctrine assumed that American forces could win through superior resources applied at decisive points. These were not merely different tactical approaches. They were incompatible philosophies of warfare. When American officers observed Australian operations, they saw forces that refused to exploit opportunities for decisive engagement. When Australian officers observed American operations, they saw forces that announced their presence to the enemy and then relied on firepower to compensate for compromised tactical positions. The friction between these perspectives created situations that could have fractured the alliance if both sides had been less professional. The refusal. In September 1968, an American Green Beret captain attached to MACVSOG requested permission to embed with an Australian SAS patrol operating in the Longhai Mountains. The request was approved through appropriate channels. The captain arrived at Nui Dat with excellent credentials. He had completed 2 previous Vietnam tours, spoke conversational Vietnamese, and had led numerous reconnaissance patrols in challenging terrain. The Australian patrol he was assigned to was led by a corporal with 18 months of continuous Vietnam service. When the American captain introduced himself, the Australian corporal's response was professionally courteous but clear. The American could accompany the patrol if he was willing to accept Australian methods without question or compromise. The patrol lasted 6 days. The American captain would later submit a request that he never be tasked with Australian forces again. What disturbed the American was not danger or hardship. It was the realization that everything he understood about patrol tactics was wrong for the environment where Australian forces operated, and that recognizing this did not automatically provide the ability to operate at Australian standards. The patrol moved at approximately 100 meters per hour through jungle terrain. The American captain, accustomed to patrols covering several kilometers per day, initially thought the Australians were conducting some kind of training exercise or hazing ritual. It took him 8 hours to realize they were moving at combat speed, and that this glacial pace was what kept them invisible to enemy forces operating in the same area. The Australians did not speak. They did not use their radios except for critical position reports transmitted in scheduled burst transmissions. They ate cold rations that produced no cooking smells. They moved in ways that seemed almost geological in their patience, placing each foot with consideration that made the Americans' normal walking seem loud as a marching band. On the third day, the patrol detected enemy movement approximately 200 meters ahead. The Australians froze. They did not establish ambush positions or maneuver for tactical advantage. They simply stopped moving and became part of the landscape. They remained motionless for 11 hours. The American captain, trained to act decisively when encountering enemy forces, struggled to maintain the absolute stillness that the Australians demonstrated effortlessly. His muscles cramped. His mind wandered. He fought the urge to shift position, to relieve pressure points, to do something other than remain frozen like a hunting animal waiting for prey. The Viet Cong patrol passed within 30 meters of the Australian position without detecting anything unusual. 15 enemy soldiers walked past forces that could have annihilated them, completely unaware they had been under observation the entire time. After the enemy departed, the Australians waited an additional 2 hours before resuming movement. The American captain later reported that this experience, more than any training he had received, taught him what invisible actually meant in jungle warfare. But the lesson that truly disturbed him came 2 days later. The patrol detected another enemy presence, this time a small camp with approximately 8 personnel. The Australians maneuvered into observation position over a period of 6 hours, moving so slowly that the American captain estimated they covered less than 60 meters. They established a concealed position overlooking the camp and watched. For 40 hours they did not engage. They did not report the position for artillery strike. They simply observed, documenting enemy activity, counting personnel, identifying equipment, noting patterns of movement and behavior. The American captain understood the intelligence value of extended observation, but American doctrine would have called for immediate action, either engage with available forces or call in air support or artillery. The idea of watching enemy soldiers go about their activities for nearly 2 days without taking action seemed like wasted opportunity. When the patrol finally withdrew and reported their observations, the Australian patrol leader's assessment was that the enemy camp was a temporary position that would be abandoned within days. Engaging would have achieved minimal tactical gain while revealing Australian presence in the area. Better to document and continue monitoring. The American captain's after-action report noted that Australian SAS operations required a level of patience and self-discipline that American training did not emphasize. The report concluded with a recommendation that American Special Operations Forces study Australian methods, but also acknowledged that cultural differences might make full adoption impossible. The Australian corporal who led that patrol would later tell a journalist that American soldiers were too aggressive for jungle warfare. The comment was not intended as criticism. It was observation. Americans were trained to fight, and they were good at fighting. But fighting was only valuable when it achieved objectives that patience could not. The statistics, by 1969, the operational statistics from Puaktui province, told a story that American commanders found increasingly difficult to ignore. Australian SAS had conducted over 1,000 patrols in the province. They had achieved a kill ratio exceeding 30 to 1, meaning 30 enemy soldiers eliminated for every Australian casualty. Their patrol casualty rate was less than 1%, an almost unheard-of figure in Vietnam, where American infantry units sometimes lost 10% or more of their strength in a single engagement. American forces operating in adjacent provinces were achieving kill ratios around 7-1, with casualty rates approaching 10% in heavy contact areas. The disparity was not marginal. It suggested that Australian methods were achieving radically better results in comparable terrain against the same enemy. The Pentagon response was to study Australian techniques and attempt to replicate them in American forces. Several initiatives emerged from this analysis. The MACV Recondo School, established to train American long-range reconnaissance patrol personnel, brought in Australian SAS instructors to teach fieldcraft and patrol techniques. American Special Forces began experimenting with scent discipline, slower patrol speeds, and smaller unit operations. But the attempts at replication ran into obstacles that training alone could not overcome. American military culture rewarded aggressive action and decisive engagement. Officers were evaluated on body counts and operational tempo. A commander who reported that his forces had spent 2 weeks on patrol without engaging the enemy would face questions about why his unit was not being more proactive. Australian military culture operated on different assumptions. Australian commanders measured success in terms of intelligence gathered, territory controlled, and enemy forces denied freedom of movement. An Australian patrol that spent 2 weeks observing enemy movements without firing a shot was considered highly successful if it brought back detailed intelligence. These cultural differences created a fundamental incompatibility that tactical training could not resolve. American forces could learn Australian techniques, but they could not easily adopt Australian philosophy. The most telling evidence of this gap came from an incident in late 1969 that would be classified for decades. The final assessment. An American long-range reconnaissance patrol from the 101st Airborne Division, trained using Australian methods at the Recondo School, was conducting operations in Bin Tui Province, adjacent to the Australian sector. The patrol consisted of 6 men, moving at Australian patrol speeds, using scent discipline, communicating by hand signals only. On the 4th day of their patrol, they detected enemy movement and established an observation position. Following Australian doctrine, they settled in to watch rather than engage. They maintained position for 18 hours, documenting enemy activity, gathering intelligence. Everything was executed according to the methods they had been taught. Then they were discovered. The Viet Cong patrol that stumbled onto the American position consisted of only 4 soldiers, but they were close enough that the Americans had no choice but to engage immediately. The firefight lasted less than 3 minutes. All 4 Viet Cong were killed. 2 Americans were wounded. The patrol called for extraction and withdrew from the area. In their after-action report, the patrol leader noted that they had successfully applied Australian techniques but had been compromised by factors beyond their control. An Australian SAS instructor who reviewed the report identified the actual problem. The American patrol had moved slowly and maintained good discipline, but they had established their observation position poorly. They had chosen a location with good sight lines to the enemy, but inadequate concealment from approaches. An experienced Australian patrol would have prioritized concealment over observation, accepting reduced visibility of the enemy in exchange for near-total invisibility to enemy patrols passing nearby. The difference was subtle, but fundamental. The Americans had learned techniques but had not internalized the predator mindset that made those techniques effective. They were still thinking like soldiers conducting reconnaissance. The Australians thought like hunters waiting in a blind. This distinction could not be taught in schools. It required cultural transformation that American military institutions were not structured to provide. By 1971, when Australian forces began their withdrawal from Vietnam, American commanders had largely abandoned attempts to replicate Australian methods wholesale. Instead, they cherry-picked specific techniques that fit within existing American doctrine. Scent discipline was emphasized in some special operations units. Patrol speeds were reduced in certain circumstances, but the fundamental Australian philosophy of patience over aggression, observation over engagement, invisibility over firepower remained foreign to American military culture. The final classified assessment of Australian operations in Vietnam, completed by American military intelligence in 1974, reached conclusions that would remain buried for decades. Australian methods had achieved superior results in jungle warfare through approaches that American forces could not easily adopt. The assessment noted that some of the most effective Australian tactics, particularly regarding extended observation and refusal to engage except under ideal conditions, would likely be considered insufficiently aggressive by American commanders and would not be rewarded within American promotion and evaluation systems. The report concluded with a recommendation that American forces acknowledge the limitations of their approach and recognize that some operational environments favored methods that American military culture was not designed to employ. The recommendation was noted and filed. American doctrine in Vietnam continued largely unchanged until the final withdrawal in 1973. The legacy Brigadier Oliver Jackson, who commanded the Australian task force during much of the conflict, would later write that the fundamental difference between Australian and American approaches in Vietnam was not tactical, but philosophical. Americans, he noted, approached the war as a problem to be solved through the application of superior resources. Australians approached it as an environment to be understood and adapted to. This difference manifested in every aspect of operations. Americans built massive bases with extensive infrastructure and relied on helicopters to reach operational areas. Australians built minimal facilities and walked to where they needed to be. Americans measured success in enemy killed. Australians measured success in territory controlled and enemy freedom of movement denied. Neither approach was inherently superior in all circumstances. American methods achieved results in certain types of engagements, particularly large-scale conventional battles. Australian methods excelled in guerrilla warfare, where the enemy could not be located through conventional reconnaissance and where patience could achieve what firepower could not. But in the jungles of Puaktui province, Australian methods proved devastatingly effective. By the time Australian forces withdrew in 1971, Viet Cong's strength in the province had been reduced to the point where enemy forces could barely maintain presence in their former strongholds. This was achieved not through massive firepower, but through systematic pressure applied by small patrols that the enemy could neither detect nor effectively engage. The bitter irony was that these methods were available to American forces from the beginning. Australian commanders offered to share their techniques. Australian instructors provided training. The evidence of effectiveness was undeniable. But American military culture could not easily absorb lessons that contradicted fundamental assumptions about how wars should be fought. When the American captain, who had been told, "You don't belong here," by Australian SAS troopers, finally understood what they meant, he recognized that the statement was not territorial exclusion. It was professional assessment. American soldiers, operating with American methods and American assumptions, did not belong in terrain where survival required patience that American military culture did not emphasize and discipline that American training did not prioritize. The jungle belonged to those who understood that invisibility was more valuable than firepower, that patience could kill more effectively than aggression, and that the best engagement was often the one you refused to take. The Australians understood this. They had learned it through decades of small wars fought on the margins of empire, refined it in Malaya and Borneo, and perfected it in the mountains and jungles of Puaktui province. The Americans never fully learned it, not because they lacked courage or capability, but because learning it would have required becoming something American military culture was not designed to produce. 50 years later, the lessons remain relevant. Every conflict produces variations on the same theme: technological superiority meeting environmental reality, institutional assumptions colliding with conditions those assumptions cannot address. The answer is often visible, demonstrated by allies who operate differently, proven by statistics that cannot be ignored. The question is whether institutions are willing to learn from those who succeed by refusing to fight the way doctrine demands. In Vietnam, the Australians answered that question by building a record of success that American forces could not match. They achieved it by methods American commanders called inactive. They measured it in statistics American doctrine considered less important than body count. They proved it by surviving at rates American soldiers could not achieve. And when American patrols asked to operate in Australian areas, the Australians told them the truth with professional honesty that collaboration sometimes demands. You don't belong here, not because you lack courage, not because you're unwelcome, but because belonging in the jungle requires becoming something you were not trained to be. The Americans learned this lesson slowly, incompletely, at a cost measured in casualties that different methods might have prevented. The Australians taught the lesson whenever asked, shared their knowledge freely, and watched as institutional pride prevented adoption. That is the story behind the phrase. That is what it meant when Australian SAS operators told American soldiers they didn't belong in the jungle. It meant we operate differently, and those differences are measured in survival rates you should study before entering terrain, where your methods will get you killed. Some American soldiers understood. They learned. They adapted. They survived. Most did not have the opportunity to learn before the learning killed them. The Viet Cong called the Australians Ma Rung, jungle ghosts. They called them this because Australians had become what Americans refused to become: invisible predators who hunted patience and won through discipline that conventional soldiers could not maintain. That was the difference. That was why Australian SAS achieved results American forces could not match. That was why, in the jungles of Vietnam, 120 Australian special operators could accomplish what 500,000 American troops could not. They belonged there because they understood what belonging required, and they were willing to become what the jungle demanded. The question was never whether American soldiers were capable of learning this. The question was whether American military culture would allow them to become what they needed to be. Vietnam answered that question. The answer was written in casualty statistics, classified reports, and the memories of men who watched allies succeed by refusing to fight the way America demanded its warriors fight. The lesson remains available 50 years later, waiting for institutions willing to learn it. The jungle still remembers who belonged there and why.